So here we are in part B of the May 20th, Lighting the Candle, A World That Works. And we're outrageously posing for your approval, Mr. or Mrs. Listener. What if having a world that works is just as simple as how we have conversations with each other? Is it possible that we can create empowerment where there was none? Is it possible that what we are assuming and accepting as a world that doesn't work is as good as it gets? Or is there something as simple as a conversation shifting the world like a lever and creating leverage with a lot of people? And as Ken likes to say, casting a pebble into the pond. And as we like to say, you light the first candle, all the rest of the candles can be lit from that. And that, and that, and that. So with that said, we spent the first period of time talking about truth and lie. And then we got into kind of how perhaps not fully understanding, or maybe that both people in a conversation aren't necessarily at the same skill level in terms of objectivity and reasonableness with what they believe being a seeming as opposed to the truth. And then we also talked about whether making a difference in a conversation is a choice that you actually have in a conversation. And how we wrapped up the last half hour was to say, now we're going to talk about, let's apply some of this academic and philosophical conversation that we were having in the first half hour. And let's see if we can bring some real world situations where if people are willing to engage in a technology called, let's find out what you think is important, that curiosity and that question and all the rest of those sorts of things comes as a natural result of truly being interested in what will take this moment and transform it from danger or fear or darkness into joy and light and enlightenment. So how's that for talking about a world that works? So I'm Bill Carell. I don't think I mentioned that in the last one, but if you don't know that by now, it really doesn't matter. I'm just a guy. So I have another guy here, Ken, and then I have a really great gal here, Lisa. And so if you don't mind, I'd like to kick this off by asking a few questions. How interested in what's going on in the person's world is a policeman who has gotten a call that there's a domestic dispute and there's a knife involved, and they show up at the scene? Do they rely on their ability to talk to the person first, or do they use physical force to subdue the person at all costs and get them, out of harm's way for themselves and for the other people in the area? What do you think happens? This is the first practical application I could think of.
I'm not sure if it would be fair to answer that as a general response for every police officer or peace officer, or any emergency responder. My first reaction was that no, they would apply force without trying to apply reason. But I know I was going to say the truth or the fact, but I'm sure there's both there's emergency responders that have both kind of, there's some of each. There's the ones that are going to use brute force, and there's the ones that are going to say, wait, let me step back a minute and see if I can resolve this situation without anybody getting hurt, including me.
Very important. I don't care who you are. Ken?
Right.
I think you'd have to ask some questions. How are they trained? What do they prioritize? And what's the context of their past experiences? So is this the third time to the same home? That's going to be one thing. Is what's the is this a hot spot, an area that's known for violence or not? Is this unusual? I think all of those things are going to play into it. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book recently called Talking to Strangers, and it's fascinating. And he talks a lot about this kind of thing, and just the differences. Like one of the things, they reduced gun violence in Kansas City by 50% by increasing traffic stops. And they basically trained the police to look for little clues that would give them a legitimate reason, which they don't need much, to search the vehicle. And so then it worked so well, they tried to do it in other parts of the country and it failed. And all it did was increase traffic stops. And the reason was, in Kansas City, they identified this like 2 or 3 block zone where a high percentage of the crime was happening, and they concentrated their efforts there. When they applied it to other cities, they're just making traffic stops everywhere. And it led to a lot of tension and miscommunication and problems and, that kind of stuff. So, I mean, you're asking a question in a vacuum that really requires a lot more questions, and then a constant reassessment of the truth of those questions, so you can keep asking more questions.
So that's an interesting perspective. I am a little bit shaded by my experience in the 1990s, having been involved with the police, community policing over in the Taylor Court area of Willimantic, and having gone to a national cops conference in Texas. And one of the neat things that happened out of all of that was I got to see police out of their normal daily routine, where they show up and there's charisma and bravado and the uniform and all that good stuff, where I don't know how many people were there, but let's say it was between 700 and 1,000 cops from Canada, Mexico, and the United States. And at the end, it was in Austin. And at the beginning of the conference, of course, everybody had their bravado. They all had their I'm a policeman. I got to show that I'm strong in every circumstance. But by the 4th or the 5th day, we had people that were standing up at the microphone talking, and I was very touched by a couple of New Mexico police. They were twin brothers. They were both Navajo. And they were state cops. And the two of them got up and talked at the same time, and they shared about people that they had stopped on routine traffic stops. I don't know if you recall this or not, but New Mexico for a time had they had a 55-mile speed limit, and 56 miles, you got a ticket, 56 miles per hour. And the two of them recanted their stories about people that they stopped. And that, if they stopped 100 people, 95 of them, totally no problem. They took their ticket, they drove away, not a problem. 5 that they talked about, one ended up in a shootout. Another one ended up with a person, going into a coma. And one more ended up with inadvertently a child in the back seat actually strangling in the shoulder harness, because she'd been put into it wrong. And they broke down and cried at the microphone. And the long and the short of it was, they had been trained that when you come into a situation, the first thing you do is ask people, do the Socratic conversation, like when you go to a doctor and the doctor says, how are you doing today? Where does it hurt? Tell me about it. How big is it? If it were a number, is it a 3 or is it an 8? And they were trained to do that. And in the 5 cases where things broke down and got away from them, what they said was that training was of absolutely no use in that moment to shift into action and save those 3 people's lives. So I'm asking this question from the perspective of, if we're going to shift in metropolitan areas from the type of policing that we've been doing to a new type of policing, where maybe there are people that are psychologists that are involved with it, how would we do that powerfully if we think that the solution in most cases can be conversational.
I think
Isn't it
what
more-
Ken was saying too, it depends on your training. I mean, and so See No Stranger is a book, by a woman and she actually went to Yale. So she was studying law and became an advocate for police reform in East Haven, Connecticut. And they actually were able to train the officers to be sensitive to know if they were profiling or not, kind of thing. And that was like the big catalyst for that whole department changing. And then they also had to get rid of, or find other places, or no, they probably got rid of them, but to eliminate the officers that were not willing to change. And that whole department became an example for the rest of the country. I don't know how many places they applied it to, but so conversations with the officers themselves have to start as part of the training.
All right, so you notice that I picked law enforcement as the first practical application for what we were talking about in terms of upgrading a conversation while you're in the middle of it, I'm not sure that there's a whole lot more that we can do here other than making the case for, think about this at home. When you ask something of your children or you ask something of your spouse and you're not quite sure what to do with what they give you in that instance, just imagine what it's like for somebody who's out there 7 days a week walking into a situation, whether they're off duty or on duty, and their training is all they have to rely on. So you want to shift venues for a minute? You want to talk about teaching, Ken? This is something that you have great experience with.
Yeah. Actually, that's probably a good, because I think this to me, this feels more like a design question than anything else. So, and I can actually give you an example. So when I was taught how to teach martial arts, there was a specific structure. There was like a warm up and a stretch and then mechanics, and then you work on whatever drills, or, there was a format. And over time, as I studied learning, it's just that there are people like Carol Dweck with growth mindset, and just there's all this, Bill Lair, and about willpower, and how willpower is a finite thing that gets expended over time. So there's new information coming in, which led to us looking at the design of the class, not the student, not the teacher, the design, and understanding chunking and just all these different principles. So we started making adjustments. And the one thing we didn't do was say, okay, everything we've been doing is wrong and you're not learning as well as you could, so we're now going to do this instead, right? Which would have sent everyone into uproar. My teachers, my team would have, the students would have freaked out. It would not have been a good thing.
Yes.
So instead, what we did was we started adding slowly over time new elements that reflected the new information we had. And then we would see how we would measure the response. And if it was a positive response, we'd do more of that. If it didn't have an impact, we'd give it a little more time or adjust back or whatever. So, and by the end, we had actually moved a lot of our more like learning intensive, like where they're taking in information to the beginning of class, and the things that were more activity-based strengthening to the end of class, and students learn better. They were retaining their information better. They were progressing through the curriculum more quickly. So we kept doing more of that. And the funny thing is, I can track this through our teacher training manuals, which we would refine every year. We would release a new one. We would update it for how we were delivering the best learning experience possible through the martial arts. So you can see the trend, and it took 7 years, and I don't think anyone really noticed because it just happened. And now we have all of these courses in the design that, just work, until they don't, and then those will slowly be replaced. So, I think that too often this isn't working, we need to replace it with something, or we need to take this away because it's not working, instead of where's the gentle ad that can be done in a way with, where we're collecting information and then allowing that information to guide us to adding more things, reducing resistance until the things that aren't working are just no longer necessary and they just fall off.
What's interesting about what you're saying, and I would believe that you have some people that are still around from when you started. They're probably folks that have worked in Questor's Way with you at a very powerful level. And then there are other people who are children of people that worked with you when you were first getting started.
Yep.
And so you have this unique, as far as I'm concerned, this relationship, not with martial artists, but with human beings that are interested in being all they can be, like what's possible for me, as opposed to how can I defend myself, or how can I, be the, the baddest, in the bar sort of thing. Right.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the funny thing is that the things we've tested, it's like the martial arts school was just the petri dish. It's actually worked even better with other people doing everything from real estate to acupuncture. It just doesn't matter. And it's the same thing, it's not, when I work with people and I'm helping them, relearn or reinvent the design of their training systems. Even they may not even be teachers, they've just, they're lab techs and they need to teach their interns, and they're just looking for more effective way to do that. So what's interesting is we never start by telling them, okay, I'm the expert and I'm telling you, I'm going to show you all the things you're doing wrong and why everyone who showed you those things was wrong, and I'm going to show you the better way. We don't do that. We look at what they're already doing, and then we start thinking about ways that we can slowly influence it in a positive direction, and then give them space to tell us how it's working, and it just happened. It's a gradual thing. It's like, sometimes I look at some of the more systemic issues we face, and it's like you got a bunch of people looking at a seed in the ground that's going to be a tree someday, and they're just screaming, grow it as loud as they can. It's not going to work. It's just not. I'm sorry. It'd be nice if it did, but it's not.
I don't understand what could possibly be wrong with that approach.
Well, you're in a short term. We're in a short term result driven world. So if you've got to get reelected every 2 or 4 years or whatever, or if you're beholden to shareholders every 3 months,
yes,
it's really hard to take a 2-decade view, and especially when you're going to be replaced with someone who disagrees with you. So now whatever you started doesn't have any staying power, and you end up kind of circular,
Yeah. It's interesting. Lisa, do you have something else before I start in?
Oh no, I was just, the only thought that came to mind was like Ken's process is, like he was saying, is like the application of staying curious, and then implementing it gradually or slow, or as it plays itself out, to implement it like that. I mean, that's brilliant.
Oh, and the other thing, Lisa, is you say that, I learned this early on through screwing up so many times and creating so many problems for myself. Never fall in love with your own idea.
Yeah.
Never. And that's the curiosity thing. So I get real excited. I mean, I'm attention deficit and all that kind of stuff. So I'll go off, and just put something in place, and then I would get overly invested in it working because I believed in the truth of it.
Yeah.
Instead of staying curious and not taking it so personally when everybody else looked at me like I was nuts, Yep. So, so I learned, just don't fall in love with your own idea, fall in love with the result you're trying to create and be passionate about that. And then let the truth of how you get there sell itself to you. So yeah, that just struck me as you were saying that.
Two thoughts on that, Ken. One was the Purina dog food challenge that they were number one in the industry throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, and then other types of dog food came on, with the gravy and the hum and the ha and all the rest of this stuff. So they got all their best engineers together. They came up with this really, really great dog food. They all agreed that it was really high in all the things that a dog needs, going to make them live 8 to 10 years longer if they start at an early age. And long story short, they brought it out to market just like New Coke, and the dogs hated it. They absolutely would not eat this stuff, right? So there's that. Now the other thing that I think is kind of interesting. I was very fortunate, in the 1990s, I had a very good business. I had a strong team. They all knew what their jobs were and they did a great job of making everything work so that I could go be on a statewide neighborhood revitalization task force with Nick Carbone, getting that all set up. And I won't put you through, but let's just pretend like I've said, a dozen different committees and whatever people would ask me to join, I would. And so the superintendent of schools, who happened to be on another board with me, probably at Wyndham Hospital or something like that, basically he came up to me after a meeting and he said, "I like your thinking." He said, "I like what you have to say in these meetings." He said, "I would like you to be on my the superintendent's task force for designing the school system of 2030. And I said, "Absolutely, I'm down with that." And so I went to the first meeting and everybody went around and talked about what they wanted to accomplish. There were mostly teachers, there were some guidance counselors, there were a couple of people from universities, but I was like, I was the only real person that was there that was kind of outside the rarefied air of academia, if you will. I was a business owner and I built things, right? So I waited for everybody else, and then Pat Proctor, who was the superintendent at the time, called on me and he said, "Bill, what would you like to see?" I said, "Well, first, let me ask you a question. Can you explain to me what a bell curve is in teaching?" And of course, one of the teachers said, "I can explain that, Pat." And they said, "Well, we know that human beings, in a group or a universe of people, you're going to always have a bell-shaped curve with high achievers on one end and the people that are going to be left behind on the other end. And most people will be in the middle. And if you're lucky, that's going to be somewhere around a C- or a D+. In many instances, it could be an F, and most of the people are on the failing side. But rarely are you ever going to see more than 4 or 5% of 100 people, being in the A to A+. And I said, "Okay, that's really good." And I said, "Have you ever considered the possibility that bell curve could be redesigned in your teaching so that the low end of it is a B+?" From a mile away, you could have heard a pin drop. And then finally, the university professor said, "That's not possible, Bill." And I said, "How do you know?" And I said, "Are you interested in creating smart human beings that can go out and make this world, anything they want it to be? Or are you interested in processing bell curves year after year?" After that meeting, listening to their answer to my question, I went up to Pat and I said, "Pat, this wouldn't be for me. And I can't be a business person who goes at the end of this thing having rubber stamp the fact that we're going to do the same thing we've done for 15 years for the next 15 years. So he said, "I respect that." And he said, "I still want you to be like my adjunct. I want you to come and see me like every Thursday afternoon at 2 p.m. And so we would just have coffee and conversations. And I would say, and I would say, you strike me as somebody who is an amazing leader with a tremendous amount of background in making things that weren't possible before happen. I said, you're a Jaime Escalante inside, aren't you?" He said, man, he said, I really want to believe that. He said, and I once would have said yes all day long for no pay, right? And he said, now I have too many people that I have to keep happy. And I said, you know what, Pat? Maybe you're in the wrong profession. Maybe what you need to do is to take that, that desire inside of you and go someplace else and just let it roll and see what difference that makes in both your life and the people around you. So this is a guy with a doctorate degree, right? I have 64 credits from college. They've never gotten in my way, So the whole idea of having conversations that make a difference with people, if there's a fear of appropriateness, then be appropriate to the situation, because there are situations. I would love to tell you that Pat went on and he ended up being a beachcomber in a South American country and raised. I don't have how that turned out. I haven't stayed in touch with him, but my point is that when we get into a situation and we use words like transformation and intergenerational discourse and all of these like academic words, the rubber hitting the road and the execution is so important. And Ken, I completely am your partner in rolling out your experience to the rest of the world so they can all get it.
We're working on that right now.
Yes, we are. So, thank you guys for allowing me to have this podcast so I can tell stories.
Hey, that's half the fun of it.
I know it is. Lisa, any thoughts? And as by the way, people at home can't see this, but that is a magnificent striped fly on your the front of your blouse.
It's a bumblebee.
It's a bumblebee. It's just black and white.
It's there's yellow on there.
Is there? Okay. It's not picking up real well on the device.
Because I drive a Jeep Wrangler, so people give me bumblebee stuff all the time.
You know what?
A yellow.
I love your Jeep Wrangler. We need to go mudding sometime.
There you go.
So we're kind of getting to the top of the hour here. I'm not too concerned about that. You at home, you want to listen some more for a minute? Anybody have anything that you want to share?
The only thing that came to mind was I keep going back to our conversation of love, to come from that perspective when you're having the conversation too, which is hard for people to do because I know it's not always easy for myself, but if you can get into that heart space, like we talk about, instead of head space sometimes, and try to see how that conversation is going, like Ken says, and then let it organically and authentically move forward. Even your processes, like he was saying, or conversation and processes, start there too. The facts will come out anyhow. Your brain will get involved, but if you lead with your heart.
Yeah. Ken?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, like knowing that, like one of the things that we used as shorthand in all of our business stuff, we call it the helm, and it's these different ways of viewing the design of the business or the things that are going right or wrong or whatever. And there's things like vision, which is the overarching vision of the business, but then there's also nuts and bolts. And that's the things that have to actually happen for it to run. And sometimes we have to check in, and say, where I'll say, I'm in a vision conversation right now, where are you? And if the other person says, oh, I'm in nuts and bolts, we're not actually communicating because we're not looking at the same thing. And it's not a bad thing. We just didn't know that until we thought to ask. So, so it's an interesting thing, all the things we've been talking about is what's the view? Is it, I want to be heard? Is it, I want you to agree with me? Is it, I want to protect the sanctity of this relationship? Because that changes how it, what your intention is. So for me, usually I'm thinking most intensely about the relationship and making sure that the relationship maintains a sense of grace and balance about it as best I can, right? So if that's the center of gravity, I'll leave things in my bag because I'm not worried whether they believe what I'm saying or hear what I'm saying or agree with me. That's less relevant than the fact that our next conversation comes from a place of trust and grace and balance. So I don't know. I guess it's maybe a good starting place would be asking someone what's important about this conversation, to you.
So if I could distinguish something for you, Ken, the leaving something in your bag is not asking the hard question. It's not telling people something you know.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
So there almost always is this opportunity to quit on a conversation and not ask the question that really wants to be asked.
Yeah.
I'm really putting a fine point on this for anyone who is listening. Do your own homework, believe nothing that you hear and only half of what you see, and always expect the good in people. And when you're in a situation to make a difference with someone and you hear it and see it, take a chance. The worst case is that you don't see that person ever again. I mean, that's the worst case, right? I haven't seen that happen unless something happened to them after the last conversation that I had with them. So what I'm saying to you is that when we put all of this together, be curious. Be open to the fact that you don't know everything and that what you seem to believe as the truth may just be a seeming, and there's a possibility to upgrade it at any moment if you are willing to take whatever anyone, I don't care who they are, has to offer you in a moment and look for the gold.
Amen.
Yeah. I add one more thing to the be curious, because the gentleman who shared that with me, the second part to it is be kind. And when you're being curious and you're being kind, interesting possibilities arise.
And I'm going to leave you with one more distinction that might be worth a half hour, an hour all by itself. Have you ever heard the term ruthless compassion?
Mm-hmm.
Is that worth a half hour, maybe next week?
Yeah.
Yeah, that could be a fun one.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, tune back in. Any closing thoughts, Lisa?
No, that was very interesting, enlightening, and as usual, opened eyes and hearts, I'm sure.
Yeah. Ken?
It was fun. Very grateful.
Every week it's an exploration. We have no idea where we're going. It's not scripted. We don't talk to each other during the course of we really don't talk to each other during the course of the week, right?
Right.
So all that said, ladies and gentlemen, light the candle. Make the world a better place. Go out and knock them alive. Namaste.
Namaste.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Lighting the Candle, A World That Works, part of the Exvadio Podcast Network. You can hear us at exvadio.com/podcasts, Apple Podcasts app, Google Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, and wherever you find podcasts.